It is nearly over. We went through 30 episodes together and it was a hell of a series. This is the 31st episode and a summary on what we learned is still coming, which will put us at a total of 32 videos. What is left to say? Well, what happened after the Janissaries? Was the auspicious event of any use in the end? In the 2 videos we spent discussing the auspicious event, we found out that the abolition of the Janissaries filled the treasury of the Ottoman state. This influx of money was desperately needed, because in the 1820s and 1830s the Ottomans' deficit was the highest ever. This was not only due to the wars against the Russians, Persians and Egypt, but also because of the uprising in Greece and Serbia, which were even more costly than the wars. But even the requisitioning of Janissary and Bektashi properties was not enough, so the government had, again, resort to inflation. This led to an era which today is known as the Great Debasement. During the reigns of both Selim III and Mahmud II, the governments were well aware of the limitations imposed by the Janissaries and related urban groups. After the Janissaries were finally defeated and the order was abolished in 1826, in what is usually considered one of the most important political events of this period, known as auspicious event, a major constraint in the way of debasements was lifted. Only 2 years after this event, the government began the largest debasement ever in Ottoman history, reducing the specie content of the kuruş by 79% within a period of 4 years. We clearly see that the silver content of every coin declined in said period, while people had to pay more and more Ottoman currency to get hard money like the British pound. This trend continued even when the finance started to improve again after 1830. Especially around the time of the auspicious event and in the years after, we see a substantial decline in the worth of the Ottoman coins. You can guess what happened to prices at the same time. Just a hint, you're probably experiencing it yourself. Although in the short term the expropriation of Janissary and Bektashi property relieved the treasury, it was no solution. These groups had lent money to the government. Massacring their creditors was one way of defaulting. Now the state had to look for other lenders and found them in the Galata bankers. More and more foreigners settled there. Therefore, the Ottoman government turned directly to the European financial markets and thereby replaced the internal debt with foreign debt. By doing so, the Ottoman government did itself a disservice. While a government can always just massacre the owners of internal debt, it cannot do the same to foreign creditors. Economically, the auspicious event did not improve the empire's situation very much. But what about the army? Did the Sultan finally get something in return for the expenditure? Schweitzer provides a suitable description of the military state of the empire after the auspicious event. What now that the backbone of the empire had utterly vanished? Many cheered Mahmud the benefactor after the bloody 4th June 1826, but soon the applause ceased. At the Turkish borders, Russian troops gathered. On the coast sailed English and French battleships. The ambassadors protested against the horrors committed against the Greeks. It did not take long until the tensions turned into war. In 1828 the Russians invaded. The question was who would face them. Well, although being outlawed, at least some Janissaries did not stop fighting the empire's enemies. The last time the Janissary dress and insignia were seen in battle was in the ranks of the defenders of Akalchik, when the fortress was stormed by Baskievich and his Russians. Their corps had been dissolved and the dress proscribed in all the cities of the empire, and this remote frontier fortress saw the last of the Janissaries fall in a heroic and hopeless struggle against the advancing armies of the conquering Giaur, a type of the fall of the system of which they formed the last bulwark under the insidious assault of Christian civilization. This story is full of irony. The Ottoman Sultan slaughtered the comrades of those soldiers. The Janissaries became illegal, but seemed to continue to call themselves Janissaries and defend the empire nevertheless. In the end, no matter if the Janissaries or the new troops fought, the Ottomans got crushed. The Russians marched on Istanbul, taking Edirne, the former Ottoman capital, in the process. In Anatolia, areas up to Trebizond and Erzurum were lost. Under the pressure of other powers, Russia gave up most of its conquests in return for war reparations. Greece became independent. It was a humiliating defeat. To Britain especially, this development was an unwelcome milestone in Russia's achievement of control in the Balkans and over the Ottoman Empire. She was beginning to see Russia as a significant potential threat to her growing interests in the East. Over the coming years, great power politics underwent a realignment at the heart of which lay Britain's determination to prevent the breakup of the Ottoman Empire to the benefit of Russia. European powers like the French and Prussians were reluctant to help the Ottomans. Only individual officers went to help for good pay. Although from 1837 even the later Prussian and German Field Marshal Helmuth Graf von Moltke tried reforms for 2 years, in the end they were to no avail. The single effect was that the Ottomans started to buy German weapons only. I think it is worth spending a moment on the opinion of such an accomplished general as von Moltke. Although it was difficult to teach them regular movements in compact bodies, on occasions when their courage carried them away and they threw off the severe control placed upon them, they could charge the foe with their old impetuosity. Just like the Janissaries refusing to use bayonets, the new soldiers could hardly get used to timely battlefield methods. This tells us that there was something in the Ottoman traditions and their culture which stopped them from adapting to modern times. Üstün hands us a hint. We may well assume that the Janissaries were, in fact, representing the social unrest against the new reform measures motivated by their social, cultural and religious affiliations. This means that the Janissaries were only a symptom, the representation of problems which had social, cultural and religious reasons. I do not dare and even try to answer the question of which exact nature those problems were. In the end, the abolition of the Janissaries changed nothing with respect to the empire growing weaker. Its biggest threat became Russia, and the only thing that stopped the Tsars from taking what they wanted were threats from other Western powers like the British, the French and even Austria. We have already heard that the last Janissaries died in a battle not against the Sultan but against his enemies in 1828 at the fortress of Akhalchik. But in other parts of the empire, some Janissaries remained, although basically just calling themselves that. It was nothing more than a civil title used for bragging. In Baghdad, on the other hand, the local rulers and population seemed to pay no heed to the government's orders at all. Despite the imperial decree that announced the abolition of the Janissary Corps and the Janissary status, it was impossible to find Janissaries even as late as 1831. Historical data suggest that there were people who called themselves Janissaries in Ottoman provinces as late as the 1850s, and that some regional rebellions lasted as long as 7 years, as was the case in Bosnia. In my mind, this description produces the image of an old man in the 1850s, shouting at some children that they are naughty. During his time as a Janissary, useless kids would have been put to work in the corps. Another thing that did not just vanish with the abolition was the military marching band. This tradition was probably just too valuable to just abolish it. But this time the direction of cultural influence changed. Mahmud invited the composer Giuseppe Donizetti, brother of the better-known Gaetano, to Istanbul as master of the Sultan's music, with the task of training the military band, first founded by Selim III for his new order troops, which had replaced the Janissary band whose sound had once struck fear into the hearts of the infidel foes. Contemporary Italian music soon became popular at the court. This time, it was not the Ottoman music finding its way to Europe, but the other way around. The basis of the argument behind the abolition of the Janissaries was the modernization of the empire. However, every serious attempt failed, even when the Janissaries already were gone. The most serious attempt was the Tanzimat period, which happened from 1839 to 1876. The philosophy behind the Ottoman Tanzimat in the 19th century was based on the notion of modernization, understood by Ottoman local elites throughout the empire as the adoption of European political modernity within Ottoman institutions and bureaucracy. The modernization included military and administrative reforms. Usually, such reforms were done through edicts. The first of those was issued in 1839, and that is why this year is usually seen as the beginning of the Tanzimat. 1876 sets the end of said period, because that was when the fundamental law of the Sultanate was issued. This describes a kind of constitution, modeled after Belgium, France and England. An example for a Tanzimat reform was a kind of nationality law regarding the Sultan's subjects. An Ottoman citizenship would depend on the national status of the parents. One parent was enough to become a citizen. Birth in the empire as well as residence could also lead to citizenship after some years. The administrative reforms culminated in a provincial law from 1864. Each administrative area got a governor with a general council consisting of 4 members of the administration from each district of this administrative division. For example, if there were 5 districts, 20 administrators would be selected. These administrators elected 3 members of the provincial general council. These members would take requests from the districts to the general council. The province's general council again would determine members of a committee through a secret electoral vote. For the whole empire, such a committee could reach 118 representatives. Please note that the election process must not be understood in a modern-day sense. The populace did not cast votes, the administrators did. On the other hand, the Sultan himself would select notables and call them up for his personal committee. They would receive suggestions from the council discussed before, but in the end had every power to accept or reject the demands. If a demand passed both assemblies, it reached the Grand Vizier. True, this looks very much like a 2-chamber system, just like the English and French had. But in the end, the Sultan or his trustees would make the final decision. Surely, this democracy-like system must have been a huge success. Well, it lasted from March 19th, 1877 to February 14th, 1878, since Sultan Abd al-Hamid got cold feet and ended it. A coup in 1908 forced a new constitution. Whatever the content of the new constitution, it was irrelevant. The empire downrightly drowned in the First World War. It was the undoing of the Sultan as well as the empire. The Sultans and the Janissaries were institutions who spent centuries fighting each other. In the end, the Sultan came out victoriously. But in the long run, it was of no use. Nearly 100 years later, the Sultan faced the same destiny as his former servants. Like so many kings and emperors, the First World War was his downfall. The assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate, and Sultan Mehmed VI Vahdettin was succeeded as caliph by his cousin Abdülmecid, the eldest surviving male of the dynasty, who was elected to the office by the assembly. Mehmed VI left for Malta and later Italy, where he died in 1926. Abdülmecid did not occupy his position as caliph for very long either. On the 3rd of March 1924, 6 months after the foundation of the Turkish Republic, the assembly voted to abolish the caliphate and ordered the Ottoman dynasty, some 120 members altogether, into exile. Abdülmecid went to exile in Switzerland. From there, he tried to play the role of an Islamic leader and organize congresses, but failed. And with that, nothing is left to say. And this is the place for our final stop, and we take a look at what we learned today. The abolition of the Janissaries did not change very much for the empire. From an economic perspective, debasements and deficits went on to be a big problem. Maybe the problems of the empire were far deeper than the special interest group called the Janissaries. Neither did very much change from a military point of view. The Russian threat grew bigger and bigger. In order to survive, the Ottomans had to rely on foreign powers like Great Britain, France and even Austria. Even after the auspicious event, there still were some Janissaries around. In 1828, 2 years after the downfall, the last of them died fighting the Russians. Some men continued to call themselves Janissaries until the 1850s, but this was only in the provinces, and it was an empty title, probably more ridiculous than impressive. Since the auspicious event did not change very much, serious reforms became necessary. This happened during the so-called Tanzimat period from 1839 to 1876, which resulted in a constitution. This included some kind of democracy of civil servants, but for Sultan Abdul Hamid II it was too much of a risk, and he ended the experiment after little less than a year. Finally, with the end of World War I came the downfall of the empire. It survived the Janissaries for almost a century, but in the end the presence or abolition did not matter anymore. Compared to the European powers, the empire was nearly unimportant. And now there really is nothing left to say for me, and that means it is your turn again. Maybe you know something that needs to be mentioned. Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.